Well, Peter, we're at the end of part 7, Invasions, Rebellions, and the End of Imperial China. And I feel, a little bit guilty at this point in the course, because you have taken us through dynasty after dynasty after dynasty, and I have just managed to kill off what appears to be, as far as we can tell today, the last one. How is it possible you have this extraordinary tradition? And perhaps we're still in a period yet to be defined. But how is it possible, when you think about it, this tradition going back to Shangzhou Qinhan, and that it ends seemingly overnight in 1911?
That is really striking. I mean, the suddenness with which the Qing dynasty is already over, right? Just over, in some sense, literally overnight. But if we think about it, what's over is a particular version of a centralized bureaucratic empire. And that centralized bureaucratic empire was a new invention in the 3rd century BC, in the Qin dynasty. And the Han dynasty shows it can make it work. But after the Han dynasty, in early 3rd century AD, it disappears. There's northern invasion. There's no unity. So it's only really sort of beginning the Sui and Tang that we have a continuous series, really for the past 1,500 years of the unified, centralized bureaucratic empire. Now, it's true that there's an emperor and a court, and that there's a lot of continuity in the Ming and Qing dynasties in terms of how the court operates and the rules of engagement and the hierarchical structure. But you still have a centralized bureaucratic state, don't you? You don't have an imperial family handing off rulership father to son or nephew or whatever.
After the end of the Qing.
After the end of the Qing. But today, don't you have a kind of pseudo-family in the Communist Party, which is maintaining hereditary rights to rulership?
You could argue that. I will not argue that yet.
I'm throwing this back at you to say that there are certain things that have continued in the centralized bureaucratic empire. Now with the notion that the political elite should be a highly educated one.
Right.
That has come back.
That's back.
And 50 years ago, or when we began to study Chinese, it was not back. It was been denied entirely. I think your question is fair. How can it fall apart overnight?
And when other dynasties had failed, sometimes seemingly overnight, or the Ming at the end of its rope, done in by these bandits, Li Zicheng and all of these guys, there is someone ready to take their place on a dynastic
model. That's right.
And now that is not the case.
How come they could decide that it was just finished, over, done with?
Well, you have, I think, at least 2 reasonable explanations. One of it is that the Manchu-ness of the Manchus becomes an issue in their waning decades that it had not been, really, since the early 18th century and quite or mid-18th century, in quite this dimensions, one could argue. And they become themselves more defensive. And the more defensive they are and the more insecure they are, the more they stoke kind of Han-Man conflict. The second...
Han-Man meaning the Chinese versus Manchu.
Chinese versus Manchu. The second is the belief in a world in which the empire has come to find itself in a social Darwinistic world of the survival of the fittest. Other countries are being carved up. The Qing actually does defend this realm extraordinarily well compared to what happens in the rest of the world. And yet people, how do you adapt in a moment of seemingly cultural, the question is whether the culture will survive. This modern onslaught from Europe and North America and then later Japan. It's not just from one spot. And there you have to think of, well, how did they do it? They didn't do it how we have done it. Which of their models is the best one for us? And it's interestingly, even though 3 of the great powers that China has to deal with, Japan, Britain, of course, before that, and Russia, they're monarchies.
Monarchy, indeed.
And yet monarchy becomes off the table relatively quickly on. There are some attempts at reversing this, but not much.
I'm struck by you mentioned the social Darwinistic world. And in office hours this past week, learners had written to us saying, tell us who some of the great thinkers are. And we mentioned Yen Fu. And
Yes.
Yen Fu translates Spengler,
Right.
social Darwinism.
Right.
Right? And so people do have that idea.
It's an
is
enormous
floating
influence
around.
among
Right,
elites.
right,
Enormous
right.
influence among elites.
So this makes a lot of sense. But you've said something else, and it strikes me as important, which is that there is a way in which people are now looking outside of China
Yes.
for models.
Right.
And I suppose because that's going to be part 8,
It is.
creating modern China, the birth of a nation, we should just stop this discussion now and wait until you introduce that new mini course.
We can do that. So
Okay.
we'll see you for part 8.
Thank you.